With me now is the founder of Daily Kos and the publisher of that site, Markos Moulitsas. Markos, good to see you, sir.
Oh, thank you so much. Good to see you. Good to talk to you, too.
All right, I'm going to put up that straw poll here again because I want folks to do a little math in their head here. You had Warren sitting at 22, Beto O'Rourke at 15, Kamala Harris at 14, and then Biden's at 14, Sanders is 11. I drew a little line between Harris and Biden there. 51% in your straw poll want basically new, right? Warren, O'Rourke, Harris together are 51%. Biden and Sanders collectively are 25%. A 2-to-1, new to old. Is that a fair way of looking at, of examining where your folks are this early in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very sophisticated political crowd. For example, one reason that Beto is doing as well as he is because they spent a year raising money and campaigning for him. They've known Warren since before she was senator, the same with Harris. So this is a crowd that really knows the candidates already and is, I think, most part, looking forward as opposed to seeing what the past of the party looked like.
All right, when you look at what's happened to Bernie Sanders this week, how much is Sanders' problems with this portion of the electorate is about things he did on his campaign, and how much of it simply is, yeah, that's nice, you were 2016, we're looking for something else?
Yeah, I don't think that the issue of the Me Too stuff on his campaign really had an effect on his numbers, and if it did, it might have been sort of on the edges. I think it's mostly about most of the people looking forward. It's about realizing that in 2016, it was a binary choice. It was either Hillary or it was Bernie. And now there are multiple options. I mean, I count about 24 people that are looking to run. There are clearly great options on the left of the party. So people don't really have that binary choice anymore. And I don't think that Bernie Sanders has done a good job over the last couple of years of growing his base of support, of addressing the shortcomings he had with people of color and women. And so now that there are other options, people are more than happy to take a look at what else is out there.
You've not been shy about your affection for Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris. Let me ask you about Beto O'Rourke. He did well in here. He is all the buzz in sort of elite liberal circles. What do you make of him, and do you have a similar affection for him as you do for Warren and Harris?
Well, to me, generally speaking, broadly speaking, I think we are in a political climate that is about the Me Too movement. It's about Black Lives Matter. It's about the Dreamers. It's about people of color and women asserting themselves politically in a world that hasn't been kind to them. Beto is actually kind of special because he transcends that in some way, and is probably the only white male, to be honest, that could be competitive in this climate. So personally, I think it's time for a woman president. I think it's time for an all-woman ticket. So if it was up to me, I'm looking at Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and Kirsten Gillibrand, even Amy Klobuchar. That's who I think is where the energy and the future of the party is at this point in time. Now, Beto, like I said, I have affection for him. I thought he ran a great campaign in Texas. We raised a lot of money as a community for him. And so I would be perfectly happy with Beto as well.
You know, it's interesting here, though, when you look at perhaps the campaign that maybe Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris are preparing for versus the message that Beto O'Rourke has. There may not be a lot of difference on policy, but there is going to be a difference in style. And in 2008, the Democratic Party was looking for the can't we all just come together, right? There's not a red America, it's a red, white, and blue, the Barack Obama message. Could Barack Obama take that same message today, and could that work in today's Democratic primary, or do you think folks are looking for something else?
No, I don't think it would work. And I actually don't think it would work because of Barack Obama. I mean, people really bought into his message of unity and there are no blue states, no red states, only one America. People bought into that. And then the Republican Party from day one basically said without any ambiguity, without hiding it, that they wanted nothing more than to destroy Barack Obama. And everything he did for years to try to find that common ground was basically used by Republicans against Obama. And we were watching. We were watching the entire time, and so there isn't a lot of appetite for anybody that says there aren't red states when clearly there are. And we've seen them. And because of that, there are children in cages in the border. There are people who right now don't have food, don't have money to buy food because of the shutdown. There are clear differences. And this is where I think Beto and maybe Amy Klobuchar would have problems in their message, because they're about unity and about not creating divisions. And there are divisions in this country, and we need to confront those head on. Right. And I do suspect that the candidates that make that very clear in the primary are the ones that are going to come out ahead.
I'm curious, you said something, you said it's going to be really tough for any white male, maybe outside of Beto O'Rourke, to transcend this moment. Do you feel that way about both Joe Biden and Sherrod Brown, too, sort of the other two that I think, particularly Sherrod Brown, who may have more in common with Warren and Harris ideologically?
Right. Ideologically, he's perfect. I mean, there would be no problems there. I just think that there is this moment right now where women are ascendant. I mean, they're about 60% of the Democratic Party. White men voted with Democrats, I think 39% last year in the 2018 midterm elections. So it's a party that is basically fueled by women and people of color. And it's candidates that were most exciting in 2018 were women and people of color. And that's where sort of the energy is. That's what the base is looking at, candidates that look like them. And so it is a moment that doesn't, it's not kind for candidates like Sherrod Brown, Joe Biden, Jeff Merkley, any of these candidates that aren't women of color, or women or candidates of color.
Before I let you go, I had Debbie Dingell on earlier, Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan. You could hear in her voice they just want to end the shutdown. I'm not saying they're going to capitulate to the president, but it does sound like they may try to come up with some compromise that gives him a fig leaf. How will your community react to that?
It depends on what that compromise is. I mean, it's really going to be the details. If it's a capitulation of Trump in any substantive way, obviously people aren't going to be happy about it. And there's really no reason politically for Democrats to do that. It's clear in the polling. It's clear in where the energy is in the party, in the country right now, that the Democrats have the upper hand. And there's no reason to give Trump an out that he himself created. He boxed himself in. Therefore, he needs to either come up with major concessions to end the shutdown, or we continue to wait this out. This is not good for Trump. This has not been a good week for him.
So you're not ready to move that at all? Not yet?
Oh, I'm ready for a compromise is great. There are lots of things Democrats would be happy to offer as a compromise, not a capitulation, though.
Markos Moulitsas, it's going to be fun to talk to you throughout the year and figure out where this party is headed, particularly in the progressive lane. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you sharing your views.
Thank you so much.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.